to mold his political philosophy, but because he, almost more than anyone else, was responsible for the spread of democracy throughout the world. The idea, breathtaking, radical, and revolutionary at the time, in many places in the world it still is that not kings, not priests, not big city bosses, not dictators, not a military cabal, not a de facto conspiracy of the wealthy, but ordinary people working together are to rule the nations. Not only was Jefferson a leading theoretician of this cause, he was also involved in the most practical way, helping to bring about the great American political experiment that has, all over the world, been admired and emulated since. He died at Monticello on July 4, 1826, 50 years to the day after the colonies issued that stirring document written by Jefferson called the Declaration of Independence. It was denounced by conservatives worldwide. Monarchy, aristocracy, and state-supported religion, that's what conservatives were defending then. In a letter composed a few days before his death, he wrote that it was the light of science that had demonstrated that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor were a favoured few born booted and spurred. He had written in the Declaration of Independence that we all must have the same opportunities, the same unalienable rights. And if the definition of all was disgracefully incomplete in 1776, the spirit of the Declaration was generous enough that today all is far more inclusive. Jefferson was a student of history, not just the compliant and safe history that praises our own time or country or ethnic group, but the real history of real humans, our weaknesses as well as our strengths. History taught him that the rich and powerful will steal and oppress if given half a chance. He described the governments of Europe, which he saw at first hand as the American ambassador to France. Under the pretense of government, he said, they had divided their nations into two classes, wolves and sheep. Jefferson taught that every government degenerates when it is left to the rulers alone, because rulers, by the very act of ruling, misuse the public trust. The people themselves, he said, are the only prudent repository of power. But he worried that the people, and the argument goes back to Thucydides and Aristotle, are easily misled. So he advocated safeguards, insurance policies. One was the constitutional separation of powers. Accordingly, various groups, some pursuing their own selfish interests, balance one another, preventing any one of them from running away with the country. The executive, legislative, and judicial branches, the House and the Senate, the states and the federal government. He also stressed, passionately and repeatedly, that it was essential for the people to understand the risks and benefits of government, to educate themselves, and to involve themselves in the political process. Without that, he said, the wolves will take over. Here's how he put it in Notes on Virginia, stressing how the powerful and unscrupulous find zones of vulnerability they can exploit. In every government on earth is some trace of human weakness, some germ of corruption and degeneracy, which cunning will discover and wickedness insensibly open, cultivate and improve. Every government degenerates when trusted to the rulers of the people alone. The people themselves, therefore, are its only safe depositories, and to render even them safe, their minds must be improved. Jefferson had little to do with the actual writing of the U.S. Constitution. As it was being formulated, he was serving as American minister to France. When he read its provisions, he was pleased, but with two reservations. One deficiency: no limit was provided on the number of terms the president could serve. This, Jefferson feared, was a way for a president to become a king, in fact, if not in law. The other major deficiency was the absence of a Bill of Rights. The citizen, the average person, was insufficiently protected, Jefferson thought, from the inevitable abuses of those in power. He advocated freedom of speech, in part so that even wildly unpopular views could be expressed, so that deviations from the conventional wisdom could be offered for consideration. Personally, he was an extremely amiable man, reluctant to criticize even his sworn enemies. He displayed a bust of his arch-adversary Alexander Hamilton in the vestibule at Monticello. Nevertheless, he believed that the habit of skepticism is an essential prerequisite for responsible citizenship. He argued that the cost of education is trivial compared to the cost of ignorance, of leaving the government to the wolves. He taught that the country is safe only when the people rule. Part of the duty of citizenship is not to be intimidated into conformity. I wish that the oath of citizenship taken by recent immigrants and the pledge that students routinely recite included something like, "I promise to question everything my leaders tell me." That would be really to Thomas Jefferson's point. I promise to use my critical faculties. I promise to develop my independence of thought. I promise to educate myself so I can make my own judgments. I also wish that the Pledge of Allegiance were directed at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, as it is when the President takes his oath of office, rather than to the flag and the nation. When we consider the founders of our nation, Jefferson, Washington, Samuel and John Adams, Madison and Monroe, Benjamin Franklin, Tom Paine and many others, we have before us a list of at least 10 and maybe even dozens of great political leaders. They were well educated. Products of the European Enlightenment, they were students of history. They knew human fallibility and weakness and corruptibility. They were fluent in the English language. They wrote their own speeches. They were realistic and practical, and at the same time motivated by high principles. They were not checking the pollsters on what to think this week. They knew what to think. They were comfortable with long-term thinking, planning even further ahead than the next election. They were self-sufficient, not requiring careers as politicians or lobbyists to make a living. They were able to bring out the best in us. They were interested in, and at least two of them, fluent in science. They attempted to set a course for the United States into the far future, not so much by establishing laws as by setting limits on what kinds of laws could be passed. The Constitution and its Bill of Rights have done remarkably well, constituting, despite human weaknesses, a machine able, more often than not, to correct its own trajectory. At that time, there were only about 2.5 million citizens of the United States. Today, there are about 100 times more. So if there were 10 people of the caliber of Thomas Jefferson then, there ought to be 10 times 100 equals 1,000 Thomas Jeffersons today. Where are they? In his celebrated little book On Liberty, the English philosopher John Stuart Mill argued that silencing an opinion is a peculiar evil. If the opinion is right, we are robbed of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth, and if it's wrong, we are deprived of a deeper understanding of the truth in its collision with error. If we know only our side of the argument, we hardly know even that. It becomes stale, soon learned only by rote, untested, a pallid and lifeless truth. Mill also wrote, "If society lets any considerable number of its members grow up as mere children, incapable of being acted on by rational consideration of distant motives, society has itself to blame." Jefferson made the point even more strongly. If a nation expects to be both ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. In a letter to Madison, he continued the thought, "A society that will trade a little liberty for a little order will lose both and deserve neither." New ideas, invention and creativity in general always spearhead a kind of freedom, a breaking out from hobbling constraints. Freedom is a prerequisite for continuing the delicate experiment of science, which is one reason the Soviet Union could not remain a totalitarian state and be technologically competitive. At the same time, science, or rather its delicate mix of openness and skepticism and its encouragement of diversity and debate, is a prerequisite for continuing the delicate experiment of freedom in an industrial and highly technological society. Once you questioned the religious insistence on the prevailing view that the Earth was at the center of the universe, why should you accept the repeated and confident assertions by religious leaders that God sent kings to rule over us? In the 17th century, it was easy to whip English and colonial juries into a frenzy over this impiety or that heresy.